a little bit different. We talked some about, I talked about river systems. Dr. Greenwood talked about wetting systems. So this is the other group of wetlands here. So first of all, we're going to find out, and I should have I made sure that I opened up the outline for you this time. So first, one definition about that, basically what you're going to find in the world here, there's two different ways of talking about wetlands. As a biologist, we tend to talk about the ecological definition, but that's only one of the two definitions. Okay. Where everything about wetlands exists in the world is basically this manual right here. It was written in 1979. There's been some that have been written after it, but this is the book. So what is a wetland, what is not a wetland? And this book is the classification of wetlands and deep water habitats of the United States. So this basically describes when you're looking at a system, how would you classify it? It's sort of like when we look at animals, what family are they? What order are they? What genus are they? Okay, so this is a system of classification of wetlands and deep water habitats. So primarily it's wetlands and lentic systems both. Though there's actually some loading gets in this too. But this is the book that's used by everything. It's for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And according to this, don't write this down. Just I want to talk about the definition here. Wetlands are lands that are transitional between terrestrial and aquatic. Water table is at or near the surface, or that the land is covered by shallow water. Must have one or more of the three attributes. This is how you can tell it's an ecological definition. Must have one or more of the three attributes. The other definition of wetlands is called jurisdictional wetlands. That's the one you hear about all the time, people destroying wetlands and all this. That definition says must have all three. And so there are things that an ecologist would call a wetland that a court of law would say, no, it's not. Okay, and what are those three things? The three great pillars that hold up the concept of wetlands are, okay, at least periodically the land supports predominantly hydrophytes. What this means is that the plants that are growing there are the plants you would expect to find in a wetland. Hydrophyte means wet plant. Okay. Second, that the substrate, the soil, is predominantly hydric soil. It's soils processes that are formed due to large amounts being flooded most of the time. And finally, of course, the overall writing factor, the substrate is non-soil and is saturated with water or covered by shallow water sometime during the growing season. So you've got to have hydrology, you've got to have soil, the three H's: hydrology, hydric soil, hydrophytes. Those are the three things that make a wetland. Okay. So important features. Okay. So basically, one thing about its definition, it's big, it's broad, it can cover lots of different stuff. The emphasis is on water, plant, and soil. And the other thing too is they talk about this word transitional is good because it's good. It's not always a wet area, it's sometimes a dry area. It's not, sometimes it looks like it's aquatic, other times it's not aquatic. Okay. So I mean, we find so again, I'm just go back and define these terms. Hydrophytes. Hydrophytes are plants that are adapted to wet conditions. These are cattails here. They're very wet plants. And then hydric soils. This is the example of hydric soils. And soils that form during conditions of they're saturated a lot, they're flooded a lot, and a lot of water. And what happens with the flooding is, so this is not a non-biotic, an abiotic thing going on here. You flood these, if you think of soils, there's plenty of organic matter in them for bacteria to live and all sorts of things. Well, once you take away the oxygen, you've changed all the rules. Because most things need oxygen to do respiration. Some things don't. And so when they start going to work, these soils start to change. Instead of having oxygen as their primary electron acceptor, that's how life works, that's how come you're alive. The reason why you need oxygen is without oxygen you don't have a primary electron acceptor. Remember, oxygen is an electron hog. They love grabbing that. So oxygen turns into water inside of you. Well, if you don't have oxygen, there are other things that'll work. Not for you, you'll die. But there's certain bacteria that can use nitrogen. Other bacteria that can use sulfur, some that can use manganese, some that can even use carbon. And so as a result, the whole chemical complex of the soil suddenly starts changing. And so these are what makes hydric soils different. Okay. The other sort of wetlands then are what we call jurisdictional wetlands. And so these definitions are legal ones. Okay. And who's in charge of this? Who determines who's the boss of wetlands? And it depends on what wetlands you're talking about. There are two bosses in North America. The first is the Army Corps of Engineers. They are charged with protecting, regulating, assessing wetlands in many different cases. Okay. Again, what are they? They're part of the Department of Defense, but it's a strange, I don't know if you've ever worked with the Army Corps. I've worked with them a lot. A number of my students over the past 30 years have gone to work for the Corps in Memphis. And basically it's a quasi-military organization. All the heads are generals, but a lot of civilians work for those generals. Sometimes they work with the US EPA, okay, our Environmental Protection Agency. The US EPA is not mandated to protect wetlands. However, they are mandated instead to protect the environment, so they work together. It's still the Army Corps' game. Army Corps watches most of the wetlands that are associated with any sort of navigation, so lakes and rivers and all that have wetlands. The Army Corps is looking at that. Some wetlands are not associated with those, and they're more associated with agricultural areas. Okay. So, oh yeah, let me finish with the primary legal statute for wetland definition. So basically, what gives the Army Corps its right, the mandate to watch this, is known as Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Anyone ever hear of 404 other than Caitlin? So this is a big thing. Okay, this is a section. This is a major piece of legislation. It talks about that wetlands cannot be dredged. They cannot be filled without prior consent of the Army Corps of Engineers. Again, EPA helps them some, but they're not the big ones here. The other big group, other than the Army Corps of Engineers, is the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Services. They're with the USDA. Okay. And what they do, they used to be known as the Soil Conservation Services, again, part of the USDA. And the wetlands that they're after a whole different kind of wetland. Basically, the wetlands of the world are two different kinds. There's the kinds that the Army Corps protects, and there's the kinds that NRCS protects. Okay. And what their protection, what their mandate comes from a completely different thing. It was known as the Farm Bill of 1985. And I'll be talking about specifically what this says. This basically deals with the conversion of wetlands into agriculture, which was a major loss of wetland habitats, people draining wetlands to make farmland. And so these guys, NRCS, are primarily dealing with the interaction of agriculture and wetlands. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers deals with pretty much all the rest of the wetlands. Okay. So 404 is known as the dredge and fill provision. So this, until it came out, there was a massive, so this, what you're looking at, know what river this is? Pretty straight, isn't it? That's the Obion. Okay. So, and what was happening was these levee and drainage districts were going in and draining these areas out, or trying to drain these areas out. You can see the old river channel here. And they basically, remember that? They straightened these out, head cutting had happened, all sorts of stuff happened. And these areas, they tried to, draining these areas backfired. Because what happened was, again, this is no longer the lowest, they put this there because they wanted, that's where they wanted the river, but you have low areas elsewhere. The water would pound out there, the areas would flood, and the trees would die. So, and this is a dredging operation. Okay. So the idea was the 404 permit regulates dredging and regulates filling. So you can't be dumping stuff into the U.S. waterways, okay? And that includes wetlands. So we protect here. And so if you're caught doing that, you can be fined. You can be required to repair anything. And so, again, so this has got teeth. This has stopped a lot loss of a lot of wetlands in 404. You need what's called a 404 permit to be able to drain or fill the wetlands. Someone has to say, okay, this is it. Provided you do the following things, you may do that. And so their definition, okay, this is basically just the definition they use. Okay, wetlands are areas inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency durations sufficient enough to support that under normal circumstances do support a prevalence of vegetation, typically adapted, saturated soil conditions. So there's the water, there's the plants, and then they just give a list of these conditions here. If you look at that, it looks like they kind of started to waffle here, but they didn't, where it says the water is such that it supports or under normal conditions would support the right sort of vegetation. Okay. They had what they did, and remember you have to have all three of these things now. And what developers were doing is going into wetlands and destroying all the vegetation before anybody could see it. So the idea of saying we're not a wetland because look, we don't have any of the vegetation. So that's what that stopped. Okay. But yeah, if you hadn't cut it out, it'd be here. So that had a lot to do with that. So when it comes to the 404 is not the only dredging charge out there. So if you look here, kind of like this picture is kind of cute. This is an ocean area here. So this is the tidal water, high water, low water, tidelands here. And basically, in these sort of areas, Section 404 covers everything from basically one end of the wetland to the wetland on this side. Everything in the water is protected, especially in the wetland this side. Upland areas are not protected by the Army Corps of Engineers. This is a freshwater habitat like we would be in here normally, and so everything from the wetland here up to the uplands here is covered by the 404. Okay, they're showing here two other things. They're showing you also what is known as Section 10, and that Section 10 is just covers anywhere where you can, it's called navigable, you can take a boat. Not important for us. What we're after here is the fact that the Section 404 covers everything tidal, which we're not interested in because that's not freshwater. So everything from the wetlands inward is covered by 404. Alright, so then I mentioned this other one here, the Food Security Act, the Farm Bill of 1985, and it has a special name. It's this provision is known as the Swamp Buster provision. So this is what was happening. Wetlands were being drained to try to turn all this into farmland, and it was basically subpar farmland, but this pretty much happened under the Secretary of Agriculture was a man by the name of Earl Butz, and Earl Butz decided he saw that money was going out to farmers not to plant, and he said that's not happening anymore. We're just going to, the more you farm, the more we will subsidize you. And there was a big push to get as much land, and even if it wasn't producing good crops, it was producing lousy, you still got subsidized by how many acres you had in crops. So people were basically living off the government with all this extra money because, well, you know, I have 300 acres of which only 100 is usable for farm. I'm going to turn all 300 into that because then you'll give me money for it every year. So it was pretty disastrous. And so swamps are being destroyed, swamp busters. Okay. So after Butz was taken out of power, this is very destructive to soils, needless to say. So NRCS basically starts with speedable programs to stop this from happening. And the main approach to this was to use those subsidies as a hook, as a hammer. So if you are eligible for federal farm, any sort of subsidies from the government at all, and you're caught converting these lands, you lose them. Okay, so you don't get subsidies anymore. So, and pretty much every farm in the United States depends on subsidies right now. You get paid to plant corn. So when a violation concerns, basically the NRCS works with them to resolve these problems and restore the wetlands, regain eligibility. Once this has happened, then okay, you've got to put the wetlands back. You're now back open to your subsidies. Okay. So their definition, again, and I'm just showing these definitions to show that they all pretty much covering the same things. Areas that have predominance of hydric soils and that are inundated or saturated at a frequency sufficient to support under normal circumstances do support, so it's the same thing, they did the same thing the Army Corps did. The prevalence of hydrophytic vegetation typically adapted to live in that world. So again, there's the big three are in there: soil, water, plants. But there now you could, because these are legal definitions, you have to have all three. But it accounts for the fact that if the land has been tampered with and one is missing, it still counts. But it's kind of just to say this now in Alaska, which has lots and lots and lots of wetlands, they're not protected by swamp buster in a lot of places in Alaska. There's a real push to enhance agriculture in Alaska, and so they're basically allowing destruction of wetlands going on. Okay. So here's the classic problem with this. If you were someone who's trying to do due diligence and you want to do something with your land, okay, the trouble is you're dealing with multiple agencies. You're dealing with Fish and Wildlife, and sometimes there's the Army Corps, got its own set of rules. Swamp Buster has its own set of rules. NRCS, that's the old NRCS name. All these new rules. So what do you do if you want to do this? In other words, that great question is asked. Okay, the wetlands definitions vary. So if you're a landowner and you want to change that, you don't know if you got a wetland, you don't know whose rules you need to follow. The question always becomes, who are you going to call? That sort of stuff. Anybody know this reference?
Ghostbusters.
Thank you. I want to make sure I'm not that old. Okay. And so this basically is, in my wetlands classes, this is kind of a nice little flow chart, and it sort of deals with this sort of stuff. Before you do anything, start any sort of new activity with your land, your first question is, well, do I get USDA subsidies? Yes. Okay. Well, have you had a wetland determination? If the answer is no, call the NRCS and get one. Okay. And then you're off to the races. Okay. If you have had it, is the area prior converted cropland or non-wetland? If it's one or the other, if it's cropland here, you're pretty much okay. If it's not, then you have to do other things. So you can work your way down through this, and it tells you when you need to get a 404 permit, or when you need to consult NRCS to find out with swamp busters. So again, so primarily what this is telling you, but the overall upshot is if you've got agricultural land, check with the NRCS. If you've got forested land, non-agricultural land, check with the Army Corps of Engineers. Everyone wants to do with that. But it's a nice little flow chart to help with that. Okay, so anytime a wetland has been certified by either the Army Corps of Engineers working with you, these guys work together, so this is really the hammer. And then NRCS works by itself on the other ones. So wetlands they have their definition of wetlands, okay? So basically, a jurisdictional wetland is one that is defined by these organizations. That area is a wetland. They're then protected by 404 or swamp buster. Okay. And then you have to follow all these rules. Again, not all ecological wetlands are jurisdictional wetlands. You could go to a place and say, this is clearly a wetland. Just look around here, this is clearly a wetland. And yes, but it doesn't meet the jurisdictional quote things. So if it doesn't do that, then it doesn't receive this sort of protection. And also, the scale at which, I mean, you might look at a big area and say, that's a wetland. So when we walk through the woods to get down to in and out of Cane Creek behind my house, when we walked in the woods, were you in a wetland? No, but if you had been 30 meters to the north, you'd have been in a wetland. It looks absolutely no different. Okay. So not only, so if you look at a big area and say, oh, this is a wetland, my question to you, really? Where does it start and where does it end? That becomes important. To the scale of less than a meter. I am in a wetland. Now I'm not. That's the sort of accuracy you need to do these sort of things. It's a scary, scary thing. Okay. So here's some example of some ecological wetlands that are not jurisdictional, just to let you know. Okay, any sort of aquatic site that's wet, has water, maybe it has hydric soils, but I don't have the vegetation. Naturally, you don't have the vegetation. That's not a wetland, because I don't have the aquatic organizations. Mudflats. Okay. Mudflats are critically important habitats to shorebirds and waterfowl, especially during migration. These are big factories that produce all kinds of aquatic insects. They're not protected. Okay. Sometimes vegetated shallow water, if it stays it's vegetated, there's certain reasons why this doesn't get, these tend not to form the right sort of soils, I think. So we don't count here. And a coral reef is not considered a wetland. Again, for all sorts of, because it basically has no soils. So, in order to do that, then, if you are enforcement, if you are the Army Corps, if you are NRCS, if you're EPA working with Army Corps, what you need to be able to do is indicate what land is and isn't a wetland with certainty. Okay? And down to the scale of, like, in tenths of meters, not just meters. I have to know this side of the room is not a wetland. That site is a wetland. I need to be able to put a line right where the wetland begins and the wetland ends. Putting a line, delineating, becomes a very important job in this sort of field here. So you'll see these people, this is a wetland delineator doing her job. So she's looking at this area here. Is it wetland? Is it not wetland? Where does it start? Where does it end? That's basically what she's doing here. And so what you're doing is you're establishing, you're putting flags around a jurisdictional wetland. You're being able to claim this area as a jurisdictional wetland. To do this, okay, again, you have to have general criteria. So again, you have to know soil types. So I look at this soil. Does it have hydric soil characteristics, or does it have more upland soil characteristics? Is oxygen playing a big role in the formation of the soil? Is oxygen not playing a big role in the soil? Okay. What are the vegetation types? Is this plant considered, and I think I'll get to this, so that basically all the plants in the world, every single plant has been given a designation on its appearance in a wetland. What you have to hope for is that you have a, and I think I'll go through these different types here in a minute here, okay, talk about them, but now I'll come back to them. That every plant, so can you name a plant you would expect to see in a wetland area? Anyone know anything about their plants?
Cattails.
Cattails, okay, besides one I mentioned. Any plants out there?
Horsetails.
Who?
Horsetails.
Horsetail? Mm-hmm. Horsetail is a good example, also known as scouring rush.
Sedges.
Who?
Sedges.
Sedges is a good one, yeah. How about in trees?
Cypress.
Ball cypress is a good one, yeah. So, can they grow outside of wetlands? All the things you mentioned.
Yes.
Some can. Sedges, probably not. But cattails can. Ball cypress can. Okay. So, if a plant can only grow in a wetland, we call that an obligate wetland plant. Okay. And it's for short, they just call it an ob-wet. Okay. So you have ob-wet plants. I think I have this all written down, but I don't want to, this is a good time to talk about it, and I don't want to miss it if I don't. Okay. Sometimes plants, you generally find them in wetlands all the time, okay? But they can live outside of it. That's a facultative wetland plant, fac-wet. Then you have some you find in a wetlands sometimes, but mostly you find it out of them. Those are fac-ups, facultative upland plant. And finally, there's ones you never find in a wetland. Those are obligate upland plants. So there are books, huge books, and of course it's all online. There are apps now. You can look up any plant depending on, and it varies too, because in some places a plant is a fac-wet, and in other places it's an ob-wet, or something like that. So it's going to change your counting. And so to be a wetland delineator, you have to be able to know soil types, understand the vegetation types, and figure out the hydraulic regime. When is this area flooded, when is it not? Okay. And so this requires extensive training. So both the Soil Natural Resource NRCS and the Army Corps of Engineers have these big training programs to train wetland delineators. And it's a good job. It pays well to be a wetland delineator. So it requires extensive training. You got to know all three of the critical areas. You have very, very strict guidelines. You can try to think to yourself, well, maybe that's what I mean. No, you have to have strict, you have to be able to defend your decisions, and you have to be certified. You can't just go out and say, well, I know a lot about plants, I think I can do this. Okay. So, in general, this is what I like to call the golden rule of wetland hydrology. It says basically, what this does, remember, there's three things, but this basically controls everything. If an area is a wetland, if it is inundated, that means underwater, saturated, just full of water, to the surface continuously for at least 5% of the growing season in most years. So anything everywhere in the United States too, we talk about the growing season. I forget how many days it is here where we're at, our growing season is. So if your land is flooded at least 5% of that time, what's going to happen is that's going to have an impact on the hydrosoils. It's going to have an impact on the hydrophytes. So basically, it's a sort of a golden rule that this will give you all three characteristics generally. So what happens is, so again, you're not just depending on that. What you're depending on is this to cause these other two things to happen. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the classic areas here. First, hydrology. I think I'll do hydrology. Okay. Hydrology, again, as I just explained, that's the master variable. We're talking about wetlands. Wet seems to be important. Okay. Because the hydrology is going to determine the vegetation, and the hydrology is going to determine the soil type. If I don't have enough hydrology going on, not enough saturation to determine soil type, this is not going to be a wetland, because the plants are not going to be there, the soil is not going to be there, the water is not going to be there. So again, wetlands, and this is just being a little repetitive here, wetlands are defined by being wet for at least some period of time. I've given you the golden rule period of time. Okay. And wetland scientists like to use what's called the wetland water budget. Okay. So remember these things. Remember the localized water cycle. Okay. I remember I talked to you about, I'm bringing that back now. The movement of water from one place to another is just called a flux. Movement of anything from one place to another is a flux. Okay. And I'm going to go through those again. And anyone that I give you an abbreviation, those are the ones that are used in wetland budgets. Okay. So for example, okay, first thing, precipitation. Okay, that makes sense, that should be in a wetland budget. And it's indicated by a P. Interception, indicated by an I. Okay. And now notice what they have here, when you in wetland budgets, if you think about it, I is not important. Because I is water that never gets to the ground. So in a wetland budget, they also have what they report what's called net precipitation, which is simply precipitation minus interception. So that's often considered in the budget. So what actually is reaching the wetland is PN. Okay. So what would PN mean? That would be through flow and stem flow. Evaporation, but evaporation is not considered in the budget. Neither is transpiration as transpiration. You think, well, those are important. Yes, they're extremely important, but they consider them together. Remember, I told you some people do that. Wetlands people do this. That they talk about ET. They don't talk about E and T. To them, it's the same thing. It's water leaving the wetland, going back into the atmosphere. Whether it came through the plant or came from the surface of the lake doesn't matter to them. Infiltration, not important in their budgets because it's still in the wetland. Whether it's on the surface or in the soil doesn't matter. So it's not a flux into or out of the wetland. That water is still in the wetland. Okay. Overland flow, okay, stream flow are considered together. So again, you've got a wetland area. They don't care if the water's coming in as a sheet or if it's coming in as a river. So they call that S, surface flow. Okay. They have groundwater flow. But if you remember, when we talk about groundwater flow, we broke it into two things, groundwater and subsurface flow. They put them back together here. Okay. The surface and groundwater together. They're considered together, so they just call it groundwater. I'm going to show you a picture of all this together here. An additional wetland flux that we didn't talk about, because remember when I gave you these local fluxes, I was talking about a temperate deciduous surface. I was talking about around here. There's another flux to wetlands that we don't have around here, and that's called the tidal flux. So if you're near the ocean, many wetlands are near the ocean. You have standard tides there, but many wetlands are near the Great Lakes and other pieces of freshwater that have tidal influence. So you always have to consider tidal flow into and out of a wetland as well. So movement of water to and from any other large body of water, primarily due to lunar and solar effect, as basically the moon pulls on the earth, it lifts the water higher, the sun lifts the water higher, and it can be pretty high if they're pulling together. Okay. So it's usually an ocean when we talk about tide, but lakes also have a tidal influence. Have you ever carried a big bowl of water somewhere and tried not to spill it? What does that water start to do as you walk for a while?
Rock.
It starts to slosh. Okay. That's called a sesh. Okay. And if you don't realize it, I mean, a lake is not just sitting there, it's spinning. If I think about the Great Lakes, they're moving. They're moving at a speed of 715 miles an hour. Pretty impressive, isn't it? We don't notice that. We're moving slower than that right here. But because remember, that lake has to get all the way around the world in 24 hours. It's moving. Okay. We're, I guess basically the closer you are to the equator, we are moving faster than them. The equator, if you're standing at the equator, you don't realize it, but you're moving at 930 miles an hour. Because that's how long it takes to get around the world, for the world to turn in one place. So there's movement going on. There's also wind movement here, so there's sections. So you have flow in when the lift up, flow out. And that's going to be inputs and outflows from these fluxes. Okay. And in basically on oceans and somewhat on lakes, they're controlled, I said, by lunar locations. Okay, not just the moon, but the sun also has a role in that. when the sun is directly overhead, or when the moon is directly overhead, you're standing by the ocean, are you at a high tide or a low tide? You're near the ocean, the moon's right over your head.
You're high tide.
You're at high tide. Okay? If the moon is on the exact opposite side, you're on a
Low tide.
high tide. What? That's high tide again. Okay. Physics is weird. You're at a low tide when it's at 90 degrees. Okay. So it takes 12 hours and, was it 12.5 hours, I think it is. It takes to go from high tide to low tide, from low tide to high tide. So the moon, when it pulls on the earth, it pulls this way, but you get an equal and opposite pull the other way, which is just weird. It's just another good reason why you should never take physics, because it's stupid. Okay, anyway. So, moon is overhead, full moon, high tide. That's tide, not time. Could be having a high tide. Anyway. The moon's on the opposite side of the earth. Okay, that's what we call that a new moon. You're at a high tide. Again, yeah, physics is weird. But when the moon's at right angles, that's either a first quarter moon or third quarter moon, you're at low tide. So here's basically a summary picture of that. So here's the moon pulling on here. It makes sense to us that they'd be at a high tide. And right on the other side of the earth, they're at a high tide too. So these guys are pulling out, that means water's got to come from somewhere. So these guys are shrinking in. So these people here, they're seeing the third quarter moon. They're seeing the first quarter moon. He's seeing the full moon. They got a new moon over here. There's no moon in the sky. Again, an interval between this to go from a high, so the earth, the moon moves around the earth to make a complete trip around the earth. Basically it takes 49, I think, whatever. So this is 12.5 hours to here, 25 hours to there. So basically 51 hours to come all the way around, 52 hours to come all the way around the earth. So I got that right, 48, 50 hours. Okay. Does the sun play a role in this? Yes, the sun plays a big role in this. Okay. So if the sun pulls, the sun is much bigger than the moon, so it pulls hard, but it's much, much farther away. So it pulls, but it doesn't have the same oomph as the moon. So there's something, if the moon and the sun are pulling together, okay, so let's say the moon and the sun are both above you, or the moon's on one side and the sun's on the other side, that means they're pulling together. You're having what's called a spring tide. That means basically the tide is much higher than normal. And if you're in a low tide area, your tide is much lower than normal. So if they're both overhead, or both on the opposite side of the earth, or one's on the overhead, one's on the opposite side, these all cause a spring tide. All of a sudden you're like, wow, the ocean sure is coming in a lot, the tide's coming in a lot deeper than usual. That's what's happening. Okay, the results are exceptionally high tides and exceptionally low tides. So wherever you are in the world, if you're in a low tide place in the world, it's lower than usual. It goes way out this time. Okay. The opposite are neap tides. And neap tides is when the moon and the earth, or the moon rather, and the sun are working against each other. So they're at right angles to each other. So it's like the moon would be way here, down there, whatever. When they do that, the change from high tide to low tide is pretty gradual. It's not really big. Very little difference between high tide and low tide. You might not even notice that the tide went out or came in, because it's not going to be that much different than usual. So here's the summary picture of all that. Okay. So here's the spring tide. If I have a full, so basically we're talking about someone, so if I'm standing here, because this is a good, and I'm seeing a full moon above my head, okay, and the sun is on the exact opposite side of the earth, I'm going to be in spring tide. Also, if it was a new moon, I couldn't see the moon or the sun, they're back over there, then that's also going to be a spring tide coming up here. So this is a neap tide. So the moon's here or here, and the sun is here. So there's not going to be that big of a change between these two. Moon's pulling this way, sun's pulling that way, they counterbalance each other. All right, so again, that's probably the last we'll talk about tides. I mean, they're important. If you're talking about wetlands, you got to understand tidal influences because it's an important part of the budget, as you'll see, but not for us. Okay. So what it is basically there's a certain amount of water in a wetland. What are the different ways it comes in? What are the different ways it goes out? In other words, what's the budget? It's like there's a certain amount of money in your bank account. How does it come in and how does it go out? Okay. Here's the equation. Okay. Don't let this scare you, because it's really actually pretty easy. Okay. The amount of water, the change in water in a wetland over time is equal to precipitation plus surface flow in, plus groundwater flow in, plus tidal flow in, minus evapotranspiration out, surface flow out, groundwater flow out, tidal flow out. That comes as a real shock, right? That's all it is. You add up all the ways water's coming in, you add up all the ways water's going out. Okay. Here's looking at it graphically. This is the graph. Okay. So this is my wetland. How much water do I have in here? Well, it depends on my net precipitation for one thing. If surface water is bringing water in, if groundwater is bringing water out. Okay. How much I'm bringing in, how much I'm losing to evapotranspiration, how much is flowing out of the wetland through the groundwater or surface water, and then I got tidal flow coming in and out. So that's what the wetland budget looks like. If anybody's interested. I'm sure did I give you one of these pictures? That's good. Okay. I hope I put it in there. Okay. So really, by looking at these things, you start to realize not all wetlands are the same. Some of these things are more important than others, depending on which wetland you're in the world. Okay. So depending on which one is important, you can define what kind of wetland you have. And that's why these budgets are used. Okay. So there's tidal inputs. There's two broad systems in the world. So you have a wetland that has tidal flow. So this isn't anything around here. Okay. If tidal flows are relatively important, if this frequency of water coming in and out is very, very important, you're in a special kind of wetland called, you ready for this name? It's called a tidal wetland. Oh, okay, makes sense. So if this becomes an important flow, you're a tidal wetland. There are no tidal wetlands in Tennessee. Okay, we don't have any tidal wetlands. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. Okay. If there are no tidal wetland inputs, if your inputs to your wetlands are either groundwater, surface water, or net precipitation, or a mixture in any way of these three kinds, and you don't have that tidal arrow is gone, these go by a fancy name known as non-tidal wetlands. So this is basically all you're talking about here. So you could divide the world into two types of wetlands, tidal wetlands and non-tidal wetlands. Tidal wetlands still may be having these in there, but if the tidal flow is there and important, then they're a tidal wetland. Okay, so now, so if we take the tidal out, so these are non-tidal wetlands. Now I can look at these three flows. In some wetlands, most of the water comes from precipitation. In other wetlands, most of it comes from the surface. In other wetlands, most of it comes from the groundwater. So basically, I have a mixture of three different things coming in. I can draw a triangle and increase the importance of each one of these things. So, if precipitation, the importance of precipitation could be high, it could be low. Importance of surface flow could be high, it could be low. Importance of groundwater flow could be high or low. If I take those and put them into a triangular shape, so here's my groundwater flow here. There are wetlands where it's not important, and wetlands where it's very important. Surface flow, not important, versus very important. And precipitation, not important versus very important here. I can start breaking up all the wetlands that you may have seen in the world here. So we start a good example here for us, surface flow being very, very important, okay? Precipitation, not as important. Groundwater, somewhat important. You basically get our floodplains. So our floodplains are surface water, so that's kind of important. So again, these are some of these names you may not have ever heard of some of these names. Spring-fed wetlands makes perfect sense, where groundwater and surface flow are much more important than precipitation. So actually, surface flow is not that important. Most of it is groundwater flow. So you find it down here where that's high. So you can just sort of sit them around. Prairie potholes are sort of interesting. They're out in the Midwest, but again, we won't go into these. But these are some of the more famous bogs, precosins, ephemerals, the Carolina bays, cypress zones. All these are different names for types of wetlands in the world. Okay. So basically, where am I at for time here? Where you guys about too much more?
Like 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, then we can do that. Okay. So basically, in the world. Okay. So remember, if we take animals, okay, or let me take, for example, mammals. In the world, mammals is a class of animals, and they're broken up into 20 different orders. Wetlands, all the wetlands in the world are broken into 5 major groups. They are marine systems, okay, and this is any wetland that's exposed to the open ocean. So this is not the realm of limnology, but there are marine systems, wetlands. These are all called systems, by the way. Then there's estuarine systems. And estuarine systems are areas that are partially enclosed by land. In other words, if I have a river coming down and it empties into the ocean, I have a mixture of salt and fresh water coming together, and that's partially enclosed in the embayment. Riverine systems, that's easy. They're associated with loaded freshwater systems. So we have a lot of loading systems here because we're next to the Mississippi River. So those are riverine systems. Fourth are called lacustrine systems. And they're not associated with loading systems. Those are the ones that are associated with lentic systems. So lakes and their wetlands are lacustrine. And finally, the last one, which is going to be weird, is called palustrine systems. Palustrine systems are wetlands that are away from any sort of deep water habitats. Having said that, most of the wetlands we see in our lives are considered palustrine. They're not exactly, it's only the big floodplain ones that are considered riverine. And even them, if you go into a riverine system, certain wetlands are considered riverine wetlands and palustrine. Palustrine is the big one in this region. I think I'm going to leave it. Yeah, there's no way I'm going to get any farther than that. So that's a good place to stop.